RPG dungeons, a staple of role-playing games. Video games, tabletop RPGs, action RPGs, and action-adventure games are full of them. Welcome to Galaxy Dungeon. In this video, we'll be explaining what RPG dungeons really are. These have been around since 1974, when Dungeons & Dragons first came out. Tabletop RPGs encourage the player to make their own dungeons, and the brand frequently makes adventure modules containing dungeons for players to explore. But what exactly is an RPG dungeon? RPG dungeons are enclosed areas that players have to explore for treasure and fight monsters. They're usually underground labyrinths. However, across the genre, this has been expanded to castles, temples, caverns, and vaults. These scenarios are common in fantasy games. However, since RPGs have become more common, they're popping up in science fantasy games as well. In dungeons, players encounter monsters and find treasure. Dungeons usually have traps for the players to run into and puzzles they need to solve in order to get through. Some dungeons have a strong enemy at the end that the player must defeat in order to complete the dungeon. These are called dungeon bosses. All dungeons are different. No two dungeons are the same. When dungeons were brought into computer games in the late 70s and early 80s, many of these were in first person, which made them much harder to play. Western RPGs were in first person. In the late 80s, Eastern game developers started making RPGs for consoles rather than computers. Most of the time, the dungeons were in third person, as the developers realized first-person dungeons are too hard. As time went on, this became even more common. In the late 80s and early 90s, the first Japanese role-playing games came out. Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy were some of the first so-called JRPG series. They made dungeons third person. However, some JRPG series still made first-person dungeons. Dungeon design changed over the years, and this has gone on to this day, as dungeons in RPGs are still common in 3D games. Because some dungeons were hard to figure out, players would have to make maps on paper to figure out how to get through. To make the games more fun, some developers started adding auto-scrolling maps on both first and third-person dungeons. Across the genre, there are many different kinds of dungeons, and there isn't a 100% consistent classification system for them either. First of all, there's mini dungeons, which are smaller than full dungeons. These dungeons are missing some aspects of RPG dungeons and are very short. However, the line between full dungeons and mini dungeons is extremely vague. One way you could define them is the purpose and the current status of them. By this logic, the categories would be ruined dungeons, dungeons that have been left abandoned, occupied dungeons, dungeons that are currently in use. Castles are a good example of this. Vault dungeons, dungeons used to store and guard artifacts and treasure. Tombs and storage safes are good examples of this. Lastly, cavern dungeons, natural underground labyrinths. However, these categories can mix, and they depend more on storyline than gameplay and design. For dungeons based on gameplay, you could group them by what's needed to figure them out. These would be categorized into puzzle dungeons, dungeons that require the players to solve a puzzle that takes up multiple rooms, labyrinth dungeons, dungeons that give the player multiple different choices of how to get through, level dungeons, dungeons with a straight and linear path. If they have puzzles, then they only matter in certain rooms. These dungeons focus more on fighting than puzzles and exploration. These categories can still overlap, but from an analysis basis, this works pretty good. There's one more simple way to categorize RPG dungeons. It's by how they're entered, exited, and completed. First of all, there's pathway dungeons, dungeons that's purpose is to get from one point to another. Fortress dungeons, dungeons you need to enter and explore until you get to a boss or stop a great evil. Loot dungeons. Dungeons you enter and explore until you find something you need. No matter what kind of dungeons you're looking into, they all depend on how they're designed. Dungeons mostly depend on 5 things: linearity, monsters, puzzles, traps, and their appearance. First of all, dungeons can be linear or non-linear. They can be easy to figure out, or they can be complex. It's nice to give players a challenge and make multiple different paths they can take. Or you could keep it simple and make them so any decent players will love them. Both of these types of dungeons can make your dungeon miserable if it leans too far to one or the other. Some RPG dungeons are so linear, veteran RPG players will be disappointed. A lot of Eastern RPG dungeons are very simple except for a few alternate paths containing treasure. Some RPG dungeons are very complex though. This can turn off some players, as some are extremely slow and monotonous. Fortunately, there are a lot of dungeons that are in between. Monsters are another thing dungeons depend on. Monsters can be related to the theme of the dungeon, or you could just fill your dungeon with monsters from around the game. A lot of dungeons have a boss at the end that the player must use strategy and tactics to beat. Usually a boss is related to the storyline of the dungeon. Puzzles are also important. Some dungeons have puzzles the players have to figure out. Some players struggle with certain types of puzzles, but having a few is cool. In D&D, it's common for dungeons to have traps. However, most JRPG dungeons don't have too many. There are some exceptions, but traps in Eastern RPG dungeons are few and far between. However, traps are still an important part of dungeons. Trapdoors and wrong pathways do exist in some JRPGs. Appearance is another aspect of RPGs. Some dungeons may be well designed, but still look poorly. Some dungeons may look very good, but be too simple. Early RPGs had some dungeons that didn't look very good and were very similar to each other. This was an even bigger problem in first-person dungeons. Back in the day, dungeons all looked the same. Analyzing dungeons by their design is always interesting. Some dungeons are shockingly well made, and some are shockingly disappointing when looking back. Everyone has a different preference for what they want, but overall, dungeons are an important part of role-playing games, and they will continue to improve in coming many different varieties. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this content.